Thank you very much, Marie. So in the name of E+, I of course thank our partners, Architecture Workroom and the Seed. We are more than happy today to welcome our guests from Turkey and Belgium. And well, before I leave the word to Joachim Declerk, who will introduce the program of the day and moderates the debates, I'd like to mention that this colloquium illustrates the last issue of A+, that you all have in hands now, and in which Azo Aksoy, our guest today, was invited to write an article. And through that issue and through this colloquium, we aim to understand how current architectural practices in Belgium and Turkey are seeking to emancipate themselves from the dominant architectural practice in this difficult state of emergency and imminent changes in which we seem to be. Let's take some distance and some time to exchange views about the future of our changing architectural practices. Thank you for being here.
Okay, good morning. It's my pleasure on behalf of Europadia, the CID, A+, and Architecture Workroom to welcome you as well, but also to guide you through the day and hopefully have an interesting debate. Before we start, the idea of this session is set up as an exchange between practices from two countries, but in fact we could even say to a certain extent Brussels and Istanbul serve as a kind of laboratories in these two countries, and these two cities will figure as a kind of in testimonies, in proposals during the day, and this exchange of practices in that sense not as much a kind of what is happening in Turkey, let's look at it in Belgium, but it's much more a kind of common search that you could distinguish, or let's say see in these two countries, a search of practices, architectural practices, to escape or to find alternatives for the dominant practice, the dominant building culture, you could say. There's a lot of incredible architecture in Belgium, and there's a history of architecture in Turkey which is extremely strong and well-renowned, internationally known. But at the same time, the dominant building culture is not often making a lot of space for qualitative architectural production. And architects in their practice, which is a very, let's say, specific type of practice, it's not part of the cultural sector only, it's very much part of the business on the other side. In this span between those two, where can we find, develop, activate spaces from academia, from culture, from the practice, in order to develop alternatives for not just to develop alternatives, but to solve or to respond to challenges that our cities, our countries are facing. So that's in fact the setup of this conference. It's not as much, can I have the next slide? It's not as much about let's look at what architects in Turkey are producing, as it is about discussing common topics that are under, let's say, research, that are subjects of propositions in both Turkey and Belgium. We'll start today, and I'll go through the program very quickly. We'll start today with a kind of introduction on something that is, of course, very different in Belgium and Turkey, which is the socio-political, socio-demographic environment. We're talking about two different places in the world. One very much in the very center, the hypercenter of the Western European world, one being the bridgehead between the Asian, Middle Eastern and the Western and European world. So it's very different in terms of culture, it's also very different in terms of political climate, political context in which architecture is practiced, in which urban development is taking place. This is the setup of the first conversation, the Turkish and Belgian context, which will set, in fact, the framework or the platform for our three subsequent roundtables. Three roundtables which are structured around three ongoing fields of research in the architectural practice, you could say. The first being we are confronted with much more and more large-scale challenges in urban development. We see that our design challenges are no longer only the design of objects or pieces of city. It's also trying to understand large-scale structures of cities, large-scale developments. How can we actually confront with design these evolutions, demographic evolutions, climatological challenges, and so on. That's the first round table. Second round table, we'll introduce the speakers every time we go into a round table. Second round table, after lunch, redefining public space, both in Turkey with the recent Gezi Park events. The whole world has seen that public space is in fact a kind of platform for an incredible confrontation, debate about whom is the, let's say, who owns is not the right word, but who occupies, has the right to occupy, who defines what the public sphere and the public space is. In fact, you could say in Brussels, in very different socio-political climate, also there's a lot of practice that is geared, focused on public space, the occupation of public space, the redefinition of public space, and finally the occupation and design, redevelopment of public space. So these two practices we compare. And three, we have two chief editors of leading architecture magazines, which are going to look from practice, let's say from the building, the strength of the practices that are there in Turkey and Belgium. What are actually paths to shift the system? Are the practices, and there we are a bit provocative you could say, are these practices largely pragmatic? Are they doing within the given framework whatever they can? Or do we also see in practice really shifts or moments where the system is overturned, we call it, where in fact we are doing more than only filling what is possible within the system. To then conclude with all of you. The session of today is structured like this. There are round tables, but we also, every round table is, each round table is introduced by two introductions. There was one which was supposed to be introduced by three little introductions by Gregor Thompson. But unfortunately, the Danish Foreign Ministry advised not to travel to Belgium at this moment. So a Danish being in Istanbul made a decision which we can understand. Everything was cancelled in Brussels yesterday. Everything is cancelled in Brussels today. So we are very lucky that the Grand-Hornu is our location for this exchange of practice. Otherwise we wouldn't have had any exchange. So every session introduced by two speakers. And then we have a round table in which you are very free, and I will look at the room. It's annoying, so I will stand as much as possible here maybe, to be closer to you, but also to set up an exchange between the room, you as participants in this exchange in practice and not as TV show watchers. Let's start. The start of today, the start of today is in fact a look into these two contexts, and in fact we do this with two persons having both a step or a foot into practice, a foot into changing, they're both looking at me, what are you saying? A participation in the changing urban field, but also with a kind of broader view, both with an academic foot, let's say, and Benoît Moritz with a foot in practice, and also a member of the board of directors of A+. And Azu Aksoy also engaged, very much engaged in urban transformation, but more from a kind of sociological, anthropological point of view. So these 2 points of view can really help us clarify what these situations are. I'm not going to go into them. You have the biographies of everyone. I'm not going to read them, because otherwise we spend more than one coffee time at reading biographies altogether. So let's maybe start. Azu, can I ask you to take the floor and kick off the day with this perspective?
Thank you, Joachim.